The dream folded like origami paper. It breathed me in. The bottle green bird hovered. I didn't walk into it. I exhaled and it caught me. My body transformed into another shape, not mine, but mine. There I was, in another place, but same time, Japan. As though I had stepped into a dimension not mapped by geography, but by memory. Not my memory, someone else's, stitched with longing and loss, and calling me by a name even I had not yet spoken aloud. Time didn't pass. It listened. The air didn't move. It held me. The sky above Kyoto did not storm. It remembered, not in flashes or thunder, but in quiet, aching hues. The kind of remembering that lives in old photographs and the scent of burnt cedar on cold nights. The silence here was not empty. It was listening, not passive, not void, but deep, receptive silence. The kind that hears before you speak. The kind that waits with compassion, not impatience. I heard it, not loud, just enough. To hear a whisper calling, a voice, an invitation. Threads of soundless prayers woven through the breath of flowering cherry blossom trees and the small, cracked stones beneath my feet. This was not the Kyoto found on postcards. This was the Kyoto that pulsed within time. The Kyoto that exists when the neon dims, when the rain falls quietly on rooftop shrines, when the soul steps forward barefoot, where temples whispered to roots, and old names rode the wind like half-sung prayers. Prayers not yet answered because no one had dared ask the question completely. I walked barefoot along the philosopher's path. Each step released something, an unspoken grief, a buried dream, a half-remembered melody that once rocked someone to sleep in a home that no longer stands. The cherry blossoms overhead were not pink, not soft. They were translucent sound. Each petal carried a syllable from the first language, the one we spoke before shame taught us to mistranslate pain, before we learned to call sorrow weakness and silent strength. At the bend, I met a monk whose face was a mirror, but not of me as I was, of who I might have been had I never forgotten the language of soul. He offered me a bell, tiny, rusted, trembling. It looked ancient, but I knew it had waited for this exact moment for lifetimes. I asked him what to do with it. He answered, "Ring it where silence hurts." So I did. And the silence didn't shatter. It sang, like a soul returning to its own name after a long forgetting. It sang in tones the body doesn't hear, but the soul recognizes instantly. The ground rippled beneath me. Like water, like breath, like truth. A torii gate rose from the mist, not painted, not carved, but made of truth I'd never spoken. A truth that pulsed in my bones every time I had swallowed pain and kept walking. I passed through, and I remembered the moon not as an object, but as a witness. She had been watching all along, not judging, just witnessing. And I remembered lullabies never been sung, but somehow always carried inside me. Lullabies shaped like questions, soft refrains shaped like tears, dream songs that had traveled lifetimes to find their singer again. It transported me to a location, 35.0116 degrees north, 135.7681 degrees east. But I hadn't found a place. I had found a resonance. Someone else's resonance. A pulse aching in the fabric of a dream, not my own, but one I was called to walk through. One I was called to heal. I felt him before I saw him. His sadness was not loud. It was the kind that crept beneath the skin like the chill of an early morning fog. The kind of sadness that had no name because it had lived too long inside his ribs to be a visitor anymore. A quiet sadness like a veil in the air. It didn't ask to be noticed. It just was. Familiar. Dense. Still. A large wisteria tree curled above him as he sat, folded into himself, barely breathing in a world full of noise. His posture wasn't dramatic. No wailing, no gestures, just smallness. The kind of smallness that comes from years of believing your presence is too loud for the world. Not broken, but maybe broken inward. Forgotten. Forgotten by the people who should have remembered. Forgotten by those who never knew how to hold something fragile without tightening their grip. I stood by him. I didn't speak. I simply was. Because sometimes healing does not come from answers, but from presence. I waited. And when he finally looked up, his eyes met mine like a child who recognizes a story before he understands the words. In his eyes, I saw the unspoken question, why does it still hurt? And it didn't come from a place of accusation. It came from exhaustion, from the weight of carrying pain so long that it had fused with his spine. I knelt beside the ache in him and whispered the answer he already knew, because it mattered, not because it made him weak, not because he couldn't let go, but because he loved deeply and the world had not known how to hold that love. And then softer, because you're still here, still breathing, still feeling, still brave enough to ask why. He looked at me like I had said something he'd dreamed of but never dared believe. And in that moment, the dream began to remember itself. The colors shifted, the silence deepened. Something uncurled in the space between us, the place that existed between my dream and his dream. The next night, the bell rang, not in sound, in sensation. It pulsed through the spiral dream like a ripple across still water. It called me without urgency, but with certainty, and I entered his dream. Not as a visitor this time, but as a guide. He was already there, waiting, standing, his shape clearer, his shadow no longer trying to hide behind him. This time, he didn't ask why, only what next. There are 3 places in you, I said, 3 paths buried so deep you forgot they were yours. He nodded. He didn't look away. And so we walked through the valley of death, his valley, his death. Not physical death, a soul death, caused by the pains of this life, caused by silence too long endured, caused by truths swallowed instead of sung. Each step into the valley felt like opening a door that had been shut for years and still smelled of fresh memories inside. Place 1, the room without goodbye. We entered the room. The air felt sacred, still, like a shrine, but not to a deity, to a moment. It smelled like paused time, the echoes of footsteps that never returned, the breath of someone who left mid-sentence. Dustless, untouched, a shrine built from absence, a room that had not aged because it had been sealed by grief, abandonment, grief. This is where I last saw her, he told me. His voice didn't crack. It had cracked long ago. Now it just echoes. His mother, gone without a final word. No note, no ceremony, just a vacuum. I saw the boy he used to be then, legs dangling off the bed, eyes wide, waiting for a voice that promised to return and didn't. Waiting not with anger, but with hope, the most dangerous kind. She didn't leave because of you, I told him. She left without you, but not from you, and the distinction mattered. It always mattered. I bent down beside the child version of him and placed my hand over his heart. A small heartbeat, still alive, still fighting. You were always enough. He closed his eyes, as if those words touched something older than logic. The waiting dissolved. The boy vanished. He stood taller beside me. The air shifted, not lighter, but freer. We moved on, but the door stayed open, and this time it no longer held its breath. The dream shifted. A hallway stretched before us, narrow, long, humming. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale shadows that trembled like memories. The walls buzzed with cruelty, not shouting, not punches, but something more subtle, more corrosive. Whispers, laughter just out of earshot, Eyes that rolled, smiles that turned corners sharp without ever drawing blood. This place made me disappear. I stopped talking so they'd stop laughing, he said. And I knew he didn't mean vanish. He meant dissolve, like sugar in boiling tea. Each step echoed like an apology, and not one of them was his. The classroom door opened by itself. Inside, rows of desks stretched endlessly, and at each one sat a faceless figure, mouthing words with no sound, words that once cut. The air smelled of chalk and shame. I reached into the stale air and caught the words he never got to say, delicate, fluttering things. They swirled around us like paper moths. Some were trembling. Some were brave. All were waiting. "I'll return them to you," I said. No shouting needed. Just breathe, he did. One breath, then another, until the room no longer pressed in on him but opened outward. The words entered him like light. They didn't scream. They didn't plead. They simply belonged to him again. We left the place where his voice was buried, and as we passed through the hallway, the lockers melted into trees. The buzzing gave way to cicadas in summer, and a warm wind moved through the place where shame had once made its nest, into a place he had never known, where his voice was loud enough, not screaming, just enough to hear himself, and maybe one day to say his own name aloud and believe it. The third path was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind held its breath as we approached. A ravine opened wide before us, deep, endless, as if the earth itself had split between what was said and what was needed. And on the other side, his father, silent, shadowed, a silhouette, not a man, a presence, not a person. He stood as if made of stone and memory. "He never told me he was proud," the boy said. "Not once." His voice cracked like dry leaves, not loud, but enough to hear it crack. The ache in those words carried years of birthdays, report cards, trophies placed quietly on shelves, and questions buried under his breath. I asked, "Do you still need him too?" The question hovered, and in the silence, the young version of himself turned to listen. He paused, not from hesitation, from honesty. Then he shook his head. "I want to not need it anymore." His words landed with the weight of every child who stops waiting at the door, and that was everything he needed to be free. The father turned. Not harshly, just inevitably, walked away into the mist of all that was unspoken. But this time, so did the wound. It didn't scream. It didn't close. It simply released, and it was just fine. Because forgiveness doesn't always start with someone else's apology. Sometimes it begins when we give ourselves permission to stop bleeding for a voice that never came. Hurt or forgiveness. At the edge of the dream stood a stone altar. It rose from the earth as if it had always been there, not built, but grown, weathered, sacred, marked by time, by grief, by choices left undone. 2 flames burned, one violet, one gold, both steady, both knowing. Hurt burned violet, deep, rich, familiar. The color of bruises that linger long after the blow, of ink spilled across unsent letters. It flickered softly, as if it too remembered the nights he cried into a pillow so no one would hear. Forgiveness glowed gold, quiet, terrifying, not because it was weak, but because it asked everything of you. Because to forgive meant to live without the armor you had come to call home. Hurt is honest, I told him. It keeps you company. It stays beside you like a shadow, never leaving, never asking questions. Forgiveness is terrifying, but it will set you free. It walks ahead of you into a place where you're no longer the victim, but the voice. He looked at both, not with fear, but reverence, as if he had come to understand that neither path was wrong, but only one would carry him forward. "I want to move forward," he whispered. He didn't look at me. He looked into himself and saw the chains. I nodded. Then leave what you cannot carry. He stepped forward. His hand hovered over the golden flame. I watched, not as a guide, not as a guardian, but as a witness, because some choices cannot be guided, only seen. He touched the golden flame, and it did not burn him. It woke him. A soft light filled the space between his ribs. Not a flash, not a blaze, but a warmth that said, "You have returned." He woke in his quiet Kyoto room. The bell still rested by his bed. It did not glow. It did not chime. It simply was. No longer a summons, no longer a wound, but a reminder that once he had entered a valley with no map and walked out carrying his own name. He opened his window. The morning was gentle, the breeze kind. He watched the cherry blossoms drift. Not with sadness, not with longing, but with presence. The kind of presence that can only be born on the other side of grief, and returned to through the spiral. I did not leave him. I simply stepped into the rhythm of what comes next. One more thread healed, one more soul resung into its original rhythm. And maybe the bell would never ring again, or maybe one day he would pass it to another, someone who had forgotten that their voice mattered. And then I would come again, because even in the valley of death, even when the dream aches, one thread of light is enough to keep the whole dream from unraveling. I am Algra Soulwin, the girl who follows the bottle green bird, who carries the candle, who plants her voice in the soil of stars, who walks every dream to return home. Whole, I am the flame bearer of the spiral dreams.